Vibrance and saturation are two things that a lot of photographers get confused when they first jump into Lightroom. And I was one of those photographers when I first started learning Lightroom. So in this video, I'm going to break it down, explain the differences between the two, and when you should be using each one of them. So let's jump in and take a look in Lightroom. Before we talk about the differences between the two, you just have to understand what saturation is on its own, because both of these sliders are going to affect the saturation of the colors in the images. Saturation is the intensity of the color in any given pixel of your image. So if I bump this image up to 100% saturation, or move this slider over to 100, you can see the intensity of these colors becomes tremendous. So much so that we're actually so saturated here in this area that you're losing all detail in the image. Let me bring it back down. You can see there's a lot of detail right here in these clouds, but if I increase the saturation to 100, those colors are so saturated you're just losing detail. Now let's bring that back down, and well, we're still zoomed in this area, let's increase vibrance. And as you can see, you don't get, it's still not really that great looking at 100 vibrance, but it doesn't overpower the colors. And that's because vibrance is really just saturation with some limits to it. It's got some protections built in so that it doesn't go too far in certain areas. Now let's look at this color wheel. So this is a really good way to demonstrate the difference between vibrance and saturation. So I'm going to switch over. I use snapshots here to make this easy. So I'm just going to click on them, and this is 100% saturation. And as you can see, let's flip back and forth between the original and 100% saturation. You can see all of these images, and you can see just the original, the colors are going from most saturated on the outside to least saturated on the inside. But when you raise it to 100, and this one's a good example, it's almost become fully saturated on this inner circle as compared to what it was before. But if we look at vibrance, it doesn't really give you as much, and that's because vibrance has a bit of a governor on it. It won't increase the saturation in a pixel that is already saturated to a certain degree. To say it another way, the strength of the increase when you're using the vibrance slider is proportionate to how saturated that pixel is already. So it's going to affect more saturated pixels to a lesser degree than less saturated pixels. What that does is, instead of being linear like saturation, let's go back to the original, and you can see if I'm going to slowly increase saturation, they're all really being affected just about to the same degree. And Adobe calls this an absolute adjustment. You're increasing the saturation everywhere by the same amount. Vibrance is different. The pixels, or the sections in this case, that are most saturated are going to be affected less when you're increasing than those that are less saturated. You can see as I go up, it's actually these in here are kind of catching up, but the outside ones aren't getting as overly saturated. So let's jump back into this image just to demonstrate. Let's go back to the original, and you can see as I increase vibrance, areas, there's a lot of this image that is becoming very saturated, but we're not going too far. It's not oversaturating some areas, so it's protecting these areas that are already saturated. Think of it as the midtones. Midtones is a brightness term, but it's kind of the middle areas of saturation are being affected, but those that are already highly saturated are not being affected. Now, the interesting thing is that it does the same thing in reverse as well. So let's go back to the color wheel, and let's go to the original, and I'm going to decrease saturation. As I go to negative 100, we have a black and white image. Pure black and white. There is no color in this image at all, as you can see. Let's reset that. And if I'm going to decrease vibrance by 100, you can see there's still plenty of color. It's very, very desaturated, but there's plenty of color. And that's because the same thing happens when you're going negative as when you're going positive. And that is, if you're reducing the saturation using vibrance, the areas that are already low saturated will not be affected as much. So what we're seeing is that it kind of caps out at a certain point much faster than saturation. So if you want to reduce all color in an image, then saturation is what you want to do. But if you want kind of a controlled reduction and get more of a lighter effect, then you can use vibrance.
If you think this is helpful so far, make sure you leave a like.
If you thought this
it helps
is helpful,
more people see these videos.
I have a couple more images. I'm going to show you this image now. And let's do a split screen. And the first thing I'm going to do is increase on the left here. We'll do saturation to 100. And then the after one is going to be vibrance plus 100. As you can see on the left, when you increase saturation, you lose a lot of detail. This guy got really orange, and it's too much. On the after, though, it's really not that bad. It's still probably more than I would want, and you can see actually, if I reduce it, you can see where these boats in the background have been affected pretty significantly, and that's really where there's a problem in this image. But this sky that was already very saturated hasn't really been touched by vibrance. You can see I go from 0 to 100, and the sky is probably the least affected area. And the other thing that is important to know about vibrance and saturation is how it affects skin tones. So let's go back to the original of this color wheel, and probably these here are the closest approximations you'd get to skin tones, maybe this one over here. And you take a look, just focus on this area as I increase the vibrance. Very, very minimally affected. They're probably the least affected squares in the entire circle. And that's because vibrance has a built-in protection for skin tone. In order to show that a little bit more clearly, let's take a look at a portrait image. Now here's the original, and let's look at what happens when I increase saturation. Now this is an image, I want to bring out these colors in the background. We took this photo in front of this mural, and the colors are really the reason we took it there. So let's increase the saturation, and as you can see, that's not what we want. That is going to be a terrible skin tone. It took the, kind of the tan skin there and really turned it into what looks like a really bad fake tan. So that's going to be no good. You want to increase the saturation. Now you can do something like mask this out using the masking tools, but if you wanted to be, make it a little easier, you can increase vibrance and look at the difference between how it affects skin tones. Massive difference between this image and that image. So let's look at that side by side now. On the left, you have vibrance at 100, and on the right, you have saturation at 100. And you can see, even though these colors in the saturation, the colors got a little more saturation, but so did the skin here. You can see that built into the vibrance slider is a protection for skin tones. So how do I recommend using these two tools? Well, as you can see in this image, portraits is a great use case for the vibrance slider because it protects the skin tones. But there are other ways you can use them as well. So let's jump back into Lightroom so I can show you that. So we're back in this portrait image, and I want to show you a little bit of my workflow for working with color and using vibrance and saturation. The first thing I would say is that I think saturation is great for color correction, but not using this main slider. Here's what I mean. This is actually the original image, and her skin was a little bit too orange to begin with because I shot this at sunset, and she was this mural was facing the sunset. So there was a little too much yellow, too much orange already in the skin tone, and I knew I was going to be increasing the saturation to help this background. So what I did is went into the HSL panel. And here I would go to the individual color channels and reduce the saturation. So I would reduce yellow and I would reduce orange. And in this case, I don't know if the yellow had that much of an effect, but definitely the orange. So reduce the orange. And then I'd go back up to the basic panel. And this is kind of where we started on the image when I showed you this photo before. And here's where I would increase the vibrance from, because I've already kind of fixed the skin tone a little bit with color correction using saturation, but not the general slider. It's actually pretty rare I would use this slider to adjust saturation, because it is really just an absolute, like I said, Adobe calls it an absolute adjustment. It really impacts everything heavily. If I had an image that maybe didn't have a person in it, and I wanted something like this background, well, then I might use saturation, because then I can really crank up those colors and play around with that. And, you know, it's okay in very small doses, the saturation slider. For portraits, I rarely use it. I more often go to the HSL panel and adjust those. But let's look at another image, and this is a fall color image. So let's go up here and let's go back to, this is the original image as it was shot. And here, if I increased vibrance, well, let's look at the difference. Let's go to vibrance and then do a split screen. I'll put saturation right there. As you can see, interestingly, the vibrance increased the blue a little bit more than the saturation. But vibrance also really blew out this red area here. So in this case, what I would probably do is go down into the HSL panel. Actually, let's get back to the original. I'd go down to the HSL panel and I'd play around with the saturation individually. Now red probably doesn't need much, just a little bit. And the reason I'm using saturation in this image as opposed to the portrait is because I really don't have any skin tones I have to protect. But again, I like using saturation on an individual color basis. That really helps you protect getting that blown out look in any one color. So let's increase the oranges. Let's take a look at that. I think we're still getting some detail there. Maybe I want the greens to be a little bit more green. And let's see what happens when we increase the aqua here. I'm really not getting much there. The blue, that really is affecting the fog down here, you can see, and the lake, which is kind of interesting. So that's a little more of a targeted adjustment rather than using the overall saturation slider. So saturation and vibrance both adjust the saturation of the image in different ways. And my workflow when using these sliders is usually to use the individual color sliders in the HSL panel for saturation. And then if I need to, at the end, I will add a little bit of pop of color or see if I can get a little bit more out of the image by adjusting the vibrance. If you thought this was helpful, then I have a free download for you. Just go into the description. There's a link right there for my 11 tips for editing like a pro. These are kind of the top tips that I would share with anyone who wants to know how you can get the most out of Lightroom and some of the kind of secrets that professional photo editors and photographers are using to really make their images much better in Lightroom. So it's free. All you have to do is go to the link in the description and check it out. And if you want to see some more great Lightroom videos, make sure you check this one out.